At one time or another, we will all look at current events, or most of us will look at current events happening, things that we don't understand, and we will say something to the effect of, what in the world is God doing? And insofar as God has not confided in me, He's not added me as one of His consultants, I'm going to attempt to answer that question. My name is Andrew Green. This is the Idea Collision, where we throw a bunch of stuff together and try to come out with something spiritual. And maybe you're not a person who seeks the spiritual. Maybe you've come across this podcast another way and you're like, okay, I'm interested, but not too interested. We do end up something spiritual. We throw a lot of things that, from current events, history, whatever, that might not seem to be connected and end up, I think, reaching a particular conclusion. And so why don't we start in a new place here? We'll start with a movie review. Not a recent movie review, a very old movie review. When my wife went away on vacation with the kids to her mom's house, and when she does, a couple times a year, I do a couple of things. First of all, I work on the house. I work on the house anyway, but this allows me to work on the house till like 3 a.m, doing whatever and making whatever noise I want to make. And so I had like a lot of trim and different stuff to do. Anyway, and I also will get my computer out and watch a movie that I know the kids are not interested in, my wife is not interested in watching. And so this time I was watching Tora. I've referenced it. It's a movie. I won't, spoiler alert for like a 60-year-old movie, but I won't get into a lot of it. But it's about the events that led up to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it really illustrates all the things that had to go right for Japan to be successful. Now, which is interesting from a Christian perspective. The bombing of Pearl Harbor is what brought us into World War II. We were not really interested in getting into another European war. We had just fought the war to end all wars, and we didn't really want to be in another one. And yet, us getting into it is what brought the war, largely brought it down to a close, at least on the Western Front, and a little foreshadowing there. And so, in a way, Pearl Harbor was necessary, and it is interesting. I'm not a big believer in that lengthy list of coincidences, and Tora is not the reason I like the movie, and I would suggest you watch it, is that it's not one of these movies where it's based on a true event, and then you find out that nothing in the movie is real. It's just all made up. It has got a ton of details that are factual. I'm sure there's some stuff that's dramatized, but it is really factual from beginning to end. And so there's a lot of things that had to happen to get us there. And it's interesting that one fact of the story that is, significant is that God, and I believe God is working in this, allowed them to do that, yet none of what we would really need to be successful against the Axis was destroyed. All of our aircraft carriers were still intact after that bombing, and that's what they were really seeking, and they didn't get it. And so it got us into the war without doing, even though it did a lot of damage, it didn't do a lot of fatal damage to our military. Now, the reason that this is significant, we're going back and talking about the real threat in the world. If you remember that podcast from a couple of weeks ago, we talked about whether it was Hitler or not, even. It certainly wasn't Japan, was not the big threat in the world. At that moment it was. And then we talked about how it really wasn't even Hitler. And it's interesting that, a lot of people base their atheism on the existence of Adolf Hitler. Well, if Adolf Hitler could exist, how could a God allow someone like that? Why would God allow him to come to power? And I want to ask you, who defeated Adolf Hitler? Well, we've just talked about how the Allies jumped into, or how America jumped in on the side of the Allies and helped France and England and all that. But the reality is that we probably were not the major impact in the downfall of Adolf Hitler. We were one of two. The other one, probably more significant, though we would hate to acknowledge it, is actually Russia. And it's a really complex thing going on in history, but Hitler chewed up massive chunks of land into Russia, got up to St. Petersburg. That's kind of the turning point of the Eastern Front. And then from there, there's this historic collapse. I mean, miles and miles per day as they collapse. And the thing that defeated them, one of them was the weather. They were not prepared for the weather. But the other thing is that Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union had just a massive amount of tanks. They weren't quality tanks, but they just had a ton of them, and they just throw these meat waves. That they do the same thing that they're doing today, just these meat waves, and they had so many more people than Germany, especially since Germany's fighting on two fronts. And so by the time Joseph Stalin they get back there, Adolf Hitler is exhausted. His armies, they're drafting like 12 and 14-year-olds and 70-year-olds. So it's crazy. But also Russia has chewed up a lot of their capability by the time they get to Berlin. And we happened to be there too. So it was good for us to jump in the war. And the reason I say this is, why does Joseph Stalin have all these tanks? Why? Well, he was quite likely planning his own European invasion at the exact moment that Adolf Hitler jumped in. In other words, Adolf Hitler might have been allowed to be there by God simply because he needed to be there to prevent something worse. God chewed up those tanks and chewed up all that firepower. So by the time they get to Berlin, America and Russia get to Berlin almost the same exact time. The timing is impeccable. And so America's there, England's there, like our forces are there on the west. And so by the time Russia gets there, that basically becomes the dividing line. And if we had not jumped into the war, if Pearl Harbor never happened, we don't jump into the war. If we don't jump into the war, probably England is over. And probably Russia gets to Germany and just keeps on rolling straight through. And especially if Hitler hadn't been much of a power or had been there at all. There's so much more happening, and this is the point. There's so much more happening, and we say, what in the world is God doing this for? What is he allowing this for? And there's so many things that we just don't realize, that God is so far ahead of us when we look and we don't understand things. Can you imagine facing a communist empire that stretches across Europe, so across the Atlantic from that view, and then to China across the Pacific? Can you imagine? We would be completely surrounded by communism. Now, would the United States have survived? That's a really good question. We cannot always know what God is doing in the world, and that's important for us to know. Let's jump forward in history. Throw something again that you would never have thought to talk about when we're talking about World War II and Pearl Harbor. Why did we invade Iraq? Oh, this is a lot of controversy here. We talk about war for oil, and you get the people way out there who are all into conspiracy Never get enough of a good conspiracy theory. And, well, did you know that Saddam Hussein claimed to be a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and that just prior to the Iraqi war starting, he was laying the groundwork for the rebuilding of the Tower of Babel, trying to rebuild Babylon. Okay, now let's jump into ancient history. Do you know who else wanted to rebuild Babylon? Somebody who, famous in history, one of the most famous people in all of history. It's correct, Alexander the Great. If you guessed Alexander the Great, you have it. Do you know where Alexander the Great died? Alexander the Great died in what remained of Nebuchadnezzar's palace as he was getting ready for a construction project. Let me read this from Isaiah 13:19 and 20. It says this. It says, Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms and splendor and the pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited. It will never be lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherd will make his flocks to lie down there. God says, listen, it's going away. Don't rebuild it. It's not going to go well for you. And so it's possible that the Iraq War and the death of Alexander the Great have the same divine source. I mean, Alexander the Great dies in the prime of his career. No one knows why he died. There's all sorts of theories, but he just randomly dies after, a few years of conquering all the way to India. Boom, done, gone. Just the point is we don't have a knowledge of what's going on. We think sometimes we know better than God. In fact, there's a person in Bible history that thought he knew better than God. It was Peter. Jesus is telling them about his immediate future and some of the downfall of himself in terms of his life coming to a close prior to his resurrection. And Peter says, no, not going to happen. And Jesus looks up and he says, get behind me, Satan. Now, obviously, Peter wasn't Satan, but he's saying, listen, you're standing for things that are opposed to God. You don't know what's happening, and this has to happen, and this is good for the world, even if at this moment it looks bad for you. It doesn't seem like something you think God should do. The death of the Messiah, that shouldn't happen. That seems to interrupt your great ministry. Like, this is the culmination of my ministry, Peter. You don't know what's going on. And so we do the same thing. Every 4 years, we insert ourselves into, at least, but we definitely insert ourselves into God's plan based on what we promote. And I don't care who you are. I don't care on what side of elections you are on. You've probably done this, especially if you have a religious background. And there are religious people. I know everyone thinks that religious people are on one side of the aisle or on other, and I have people in the congregation where I minister that are on both sides of the aisle. And every 4 years, it switches just about, but I hear something to this effect. Now, if you voted for one party, you vote Party A, and Party A wins, God's working. God's winning. This is great news. Okay. And your guy lost, there's like this flow chart. My guy wins, God wins. This is God's doing something, right? But if my guy loses, there's a couple of options you can follow. This is God's not listening to us, right? I don't know how God allowed this to happen, right? God is inadequate in some way. That's option one. Or option two is God is punishing us because my guy didn't win. So obviously the bad guy won. So God must be using that guy to punish us, right? It can't be God has something to do and this is the guy that he wants to do it. This is the best way to get accomplished. No. So, have you ever thought that maybe God doesn't consult you either? I've acknowledged that God doesn't consult me. I don't understand it. And sometimes I think, man, this just does not seem to be going the right way. So I want to look at a newspaper article here. It's a Christian publication. I'm going to take some looks at this. Well, this is in the Christian Chronicle. It's a international newspaper for the Churches of Christ. I'm a preacher in Church of Christ. I'm a former missionary in Ukraine, and we're going to be looking at an article that they published very recently about Ukraine. And my wife was actually published in this journal some time ago about Ukraine, but not so much about the war as it was about the drug and opioid and alcohol abuse that goes on there, and has been exacerbated by the war itself, even on the front lines. But there's one article that came out, and I jumped to this. I'm curious about how churches are responding, and I wanted to see something, and I want to draw your attention to this article's date, February 28th, 2025, and obviously says so the caption is talking about Donald Trump and Zelensky. And so it's obviously concerning that press conference, the fateful press conference that captivated the world. But February 28th, 2025 is important because that's the date that meeting happened. And I noticed some things on Facebook immediately. I'm trying to stay abreast of, what people in my circle are thinking about it. And obviously there were hot opinions and reactions. So I want to look at this. You can tell from the just from the picture and from the caption that it's a very unbiased view. It's very objective, betrayed by a nation grateful to the church. A lot of things that we go through here. And I don't want to give a review of Eric Trygstad's, I don't even know who the guy is. He's president and CEO of the whole magazine. I don't know. Anyway. But it says, it begins here. It says, he didn't criticize President Donald Trump, who said that Ukraine started a war, and called Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator without I'm not going to go into, by the way, each statement, and this is not about politics. I have a couple of objections about this particular article. First of all, we do a thing when we're trying to prove a point, and when we have a bias, that we try and we want to go and search. This is that confirmation bias we talked about. We're going to look at an illustration of confirmation bias. So we see here, like, this is a link. President Donald Trump apparently said that Ukraine started the war. Well, that's nice. He has a link that's going to talk about this. So I'm going to just kind of open this up in a new tab just so we can follow our links and see this great source that this is. So we're going to go to, it quotes AP. And let's see. Trump says Ukraine started the war that's killing its citizens. What are the facts? So let's look at the facts. President Donald Trump this week falsely blamed Ukraine for starting the war. So let's look at this. So we had... So that is quoting this article. So let's follow our link again. We're just going to dive down a rabbit hole, shall we? And so I'm just going to click on that link. It quotes its own source. A deeper look at the talks between Russia. So somewhere in this article, I assume that I will see evidence that Donald Trump said that they started the war, and I'm looking for that article, that evidence. No, I don't want to donate now. Thank you. And looking for some type of evidence. And wouldn't you know it, we followed two links. We've come to the end of the article, and there's no evidence. So we followed our links, and there is nothing. So the entire article starts on this idea that Donald Trump said something, and that is not true. I'm highly disappointed in this journal. I expect those in Churches of Christ to have better standards than that. That is not the worst thing in this article. There's other things in this article. I want to scroll down, and I'm trying to remember where they're at in here. There's historical inaccuracies. I'm not going to get into those. But I'm looking for a particular quote. So he says, I know that people in Ukraine feel betrayed, said Noyes, who helped launch the Vinograder Church of Christ in Kiev more than 2 decades ago with her husband, Jim. Mainly the feeling is that we are betrayed by allies. Now, I understand that feeling, right? You're in the middle of a war zone, and, we lived over there. We were great friends with people. We're still great friends with a lot of people, and I can imagine that, how you would feel let down. I have no problem with anyone over there who feels let down when you're feeling like you're on the verge of something and you think a thing is supposed to go a certain way and it doesn't, and you can lash out. I understand that, and I don't really hold that against them. I think people have taken it too far, but here's where I want to get to. This is the quote. Her husband added, now remember, her husband went over there to start a church, so I expect that he's some type of a preacher or some, clerical training of some sort. Her husband added, I don't think we can depend on the U.S. president for anything, so we depend on the Lord. Right? That's, God is a good backup to the U.S. president when the U.S. president doesn't do what we want him to do. That's the essence of that statement. First Peter 4:19 says something. He says, therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Let me say that in modern English for you. So he says, when God is doing something and you don't understand it, but it's causing you some discomfort, your job is not to question God. Your job is just to sit there and continue to do good. That's your job. Understanding that God is a faithful creator. God's not the backup plan. God's not the emergency fire extinguisher in the hall. God is doing something. I have seen so much hate and so much slander spewed from all sides over the last weeks, months, and years. This is not the definition of doing good. And it is not the definition of trusting yourself to a creator. How in the world do any of us know what God is setting up? Let's talk about Ukraine, right? Oh, the borders, they're not getting all their land back. How do you know what borders God needs to do something in 100 years? God might be setting something 100 years down the road, and you have no idea what he's doing. You have no idea. How do you know what alliances God is establishing right now between people? Would you imagine in 1941 that Japan and the United States would be strong allies? Or that Germany would be a part of NATO? Would you imagine any of this? How do you know what alliances God is setting up into the future? You have no idea. So, what if these events that we see today are a part of a plan, and likely they are, of something God is doing down the road? How can you make conclusions and determine that this is bad or this is good, or We do the best we can. And in the meantime, we trust ourselves to a faithful Creator. The wrath of man, James 1:20 says that the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. We get so angry, we get so bent out of shape. We look at things and we draw conclusions, and we allow these conclusions to spill over into our relationships and impact our Christianity and our peace of mind. I hope really what you can do, a big takeaway from this podcast, is to look at what's going on and allow yourself to back away. Keep your powder dry. Anger's not bad. It's just when it's misdirected or when it explodes. Hold your anger for a righteous purpose. Don't mistake your objectives for God's objectives. Don't mistake your methods for God's methods. And allow yourself to step back and give room for God to do whatever it is in the world He's doing. My name is Andrew Green. This is The Idea Collision, and I hope you join me next time.